Now our file's all set up and we're just about ready to send this out and render it. We'll get those settings set up for you, and then we'll jump into After Effects and do some post work on it. So let's go ahead and set up our render settings. So I've made sure that my file's saved. You can always check to see if your file's saved, because if it's not, you'll see an asterisk right here. So I'm going to go into my render settings using the standard renderer. We're going to render out what size? This is 2020. We can't be rendering out 1280 by 720. We need to do 1920 by 1080. Full HD. We're going to go ahead and render out 30 frames per second. And our resolution is set to 72, which means our image resolution is the same as our size. That is what we want. Output, we're going to render all frames. That should be 90 frames, 3 seconds of animation. And we need to make sure we're setting things up to save. And so I don't need to save out any alpha channels or anything like that for this one. So I'm just going to go ahead and save PNG sequence. And there are lots of different things you can save. Some people save out JPEGs. I do that on occasion depending on what I'm trying to do. If you're going to save out data for three-dimensional space and that sort of thing, you may want to use one of these. TIFF's also good, but for loading quickly and working quickly in After Effects, I typically just use PNGs, and they seem to do well for me. The other thing I like about PNGs is I can use a 16-bit image if I want to. And so let's go ahead and save this as Daredevil look base layer. And then I'll select where I want to put that. I'm going to put it in my Cinema 4D files for Daredevil, and I'll create a frames folder. We'll just call this DD look frames. Hit create, and now I'll be placing the individual frames there. Now, if you're new to animations and rendering things out, you may want to be wondering why save out frames. Well, if your computer crashes and you're saving out frames, you've got individual frames that are already saved. If you're rendering to something like a QuickTime movie, well, if your computer crashes, then you are out of luck. You're going to have to do it all again. So it's always best practice to save out frames when you can. And so I'll hit save. Just double check everything. Saving my image, PNG, 16-bit. I don't need alpha channels. Output, 1920, 1080. Yes, all frames, standard. That's it. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to save my file one more time. And then I'm going to say render to picture viewer. And that'll begin rendering out our frames. And so I'll go ahead and speed this up for you guys so you can see the finished product. Alright, so our render is now complete, and we can play through this and see what it looks like. And so it's looking pretty nice. You see a lot of those little dust specks coming in and glinting off the reflective surfaces. It's exactly what I was hoping for. Some of them are kind of hanging out and feel like maybe something heavier floating in the air. So this is looking good. Let's go ahead and take this now into After Effects, and we'll continue to do some post effects on it just to make it even better. And so here we are in After Effects, and I'm going to import that footage. So I'll say import file, and I'm going to find my frames. That is actually my old one. So let's go into Daredevil. Ooh. I made a boo-boo. Stop. It's okay, we make mistakes, it happens. So let's go ahead and try that again. And we're gonna say Cinema 4D files, Daredevil look, and this is the one that I just created. I wanna click on the first file in my list and make sure that PNG sequence is highlighted, and then hit open. And that'll bring it in as actual footage. And so from here, all we have to do is drag it down into our timeline, and then we'll have a new composition that's created from that we can then play through and see. And so here it is playing through. And then actual real-time playback. So I'm pretty happy with that. If I were to go back now, some of the things that I might change, or I'm noticing that I really see that this is a triangle, so maybe I'd change these from polygons that are triangles to tiny discs or something so that it feels more round and less triangular. That's really a sort of a personal aesthetic choice. But we're going to do a couple things. So I've noticed, and if you notice my original QuickTime, it feels a little fuzzy, and I noticed this on the original Daredevil work as well, is that it feels fuzzy on the outside edges, sort of like shallow depth of field, but it feels kind of faked too, so it's crisp in the middle on the focus area and everything else is just a little blurry. And so to do that, I'm going to duplicate this layer, and then I'm going to turn the top layer off. On the bottom layer, I'm going to go ahead and select that layer, hit enter on my keyboard, and I'll change this to blurred. And then I'll do the same thing here, select the layer, enter sharp. Call them whatever you want to. I'm going to use a simple fast box blur because it renders quickly. If I were actually doing this for my own work, I'd probably use a different blur, but for right now I think the box blur is going to be just fine. So I'm going to right click on effect, go to blur and sharpen. I'm going to change it to fast box blur. I usually use a Gaussian blur, and we're going to give it a setting of maybe 2. So it's just a little fuzzy. And then when you're using something like this, it's really important that you click this repeat edge pixels, and you see that that will fix this little border thing that happens. So I just want this fuzziness, and that looks pretty good. Now my top layer that is hidden right now, I'm going to turn back on, and that's the sharp one. And what I want to do is mask this one off so that the center of it is sharp and everything else is blurry. So let's go ahead and create a mask. So I have this layer selected, and I'm going to use my ellipse tool and simply drag down an ellipse. It sort of surrounds my guy's head. And I'm doing this sort of at the end because I know his head's going to be right there. I can still scroll through, and I feel like it's going to work just fine where it's at right now, but where you place it and what frame you're at when you do that depends on what you're trying to do. Now right now, if I were to use my select tool and click off of this, there's a sharp edge right now, right? So it's sharp and then it's blurry right at this boundary. You can see that clearly if I turn off the background, right? So we're getting this sort of selected area. I want to change this a little bit so that it's feathered. So I'm going to just open the mask up, and I'm going to feather this in a little bit so that that sharpness is really just right here, and it eases in to the center. And so now it'll look like this sort of effect. So we get this blurriness that's out there. I also want to just turn down the opacity of the sharp layer a tiny bit, and maybe make it like 80%. So some of that fuzziness is eking through, but not all of it. So it creates a nice look, and you know, this may be something you want to play around with depending on what you're trying to achieve for your own piece. But I like the fact that these particles on the outside here are kind of blurry now, and the ones in the middle are sharp. So let's go ahead and play through this and see how it looks. So it's feeling nice. We've got a nice subtle push in. We've got some little glinting reflections happening around with the dust particles that they feel blurry now. They don't feel so sharp and crisp. So it feels a little more mysterious. I think we could do a little bit more. I feel like the saturation level on this is a little too high. I want to kind of just pull that in a little bit. And so I'm going to do that with an adjustment layer, new adjustment layer. And then I will go into my effects, and I'm going to pull up a hue and saturation. So I'll just type in hue, find hue and saturation, and I'm going to put that right on my adjustment layer. So I can pull this saturation down a tad so it's not quite so punched up. I can also maybe bring the lightness up just a tiny bit. And perhaps I want to bring it just a tiny bit. I don't want it to be purple. I want it to be just a tiny, tiny bit, maybe -2 or 3. I'm just playing with that little pink sort of characteristic that I want to pull into it. So it feels a little nicer. And if you ever want to see what those changes are, you can turn that adjustment layer on and off. So it's subtle. And then I think I'm going to add a curves to that as well. So let's look at curves. Let's drag that on here. Now curves, a lot of times you want to pull down the shadow areas and you want to punch up the bright areas. But that's going to give us, ooh, I grabbed just the red. That's going to give us kind of a bit of a nicer look, I think. Let's see if I change the order of these. I can then have my curves adjustment and then come in with my lightness area and just turn those up a little bit. And then I think I'm actually going to mask this off as well. So I got it looking like I want to here, but I want this area to be darker. And so I'm going to actually mask this layer off using again an ellipse. So I'm going to zoom out a little and click up here, make a mask. It's going to be kind of a vignetted sort of feel. And then I'll feather that mask quite a bit. So I like that, but I'm gonna tone it down a little. I think it's just a little too much, so I'm actually just going to change the opacity on the adjustment layer so you can fade it in a little so it's not quite so drastic. And there, I think I'm pretty happy with that look. And there's one more thing I want to do. I'm going to add another layer on here that's just going to darken up this outside ring a bit. And I think what I'll do is just add a solid layer. And let's select like a really dark red, almost black. And let's set that to multiply. So we can see some of that coming through. And now I'm going to mask that off as well. And for this mask, it's going to be pretty big. And so what I'm going to do is mask it like that. And then I'll feather that out quite a lot. And then I'm going to invert that mask so that it's making a dark ring there. And again, I'll make an opacity change on this so that I can simply just fade this in slightly. And now I'm getting that very dark halo that's happening on all of it with this bright center. So I'm liking that a lot more. And so you can see this just takes some manipulation and some just some modifications. And so let's see what our before and afters were. So here's our manipulated layer from After Effects compared to what we rendered out directly in Cinema 4D. Not a crazy amount of change, but subtlety goes a long way. Just adds a little bit more drama. I'm going to pump this up more. You can always, continue manipulating and changing things to get the effect that you're looking for. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. And you can apply this technique to a whole bunch of different things. If you look at a lot of the title sequences that are out there and renders that have been done by studios, you can see that they've used some of their techniques over and over in other things. And so I think learning from these kinds of techniques and processes is really beneficial. And one of the best ways of getting better in software and learning how to do things that you didn't know how to do is trying to manipulate or mimic something that somebody else has done and then make it your own. I think it's really important then to go ahead and move to that process of making it your own thing. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about your project and just some closing thoughts and maybe some more samples we'll take a look at.